The Leftist Rewind podcast looks at history through a lens of comedy. While we will be discussing important events that may have significant personal impact on some listeners, please keep in mind that we are not historians. We encourage additional research on the subjects covered here and hope that a comedy podcast is not your primary source of information.
I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderates.
This, my friends, is a day that will mark history. It is an uprising of the oppressed against the master class.
The white liberal differs from the white conservative only in one way. The liberal is more deceitful.
Produire plus parce que il est normal que celui qui vous donne à manger vous dicte également. C'est volonté.
Hello and welcome to the first official episode of Leftist Rewind. I am your host, Felix Thibodeau, pronouns he, him, and in case you didn't know, this podcast is about exploring history to find events that have changed the course of the leftist movement. I will be with you for the next 52 weeks, but don't worry, I'm not the only young leftist with a microphone. I will be providing a wide array of leftist voices throughout the show because everybody has different and unique knowledge, and hearing more viewpoints is how we grow and learn. In this episode, we will be talking about the week of September 14th to September 20th. This week covers everything from the death of William McKinley to the release of Rapper's Delight and even the unification of Italy. Let's get started, shall we? So, before we begin, I would like to talk a little bit about the events that are happening in the world right now. The point of studying history is to learn from the past to create a better future. Whether that means looking at what was done wrong and doing it right, or looking at what was done right and doing it better, there is always some way to improve upon ourselves. Those who do not study history are doomed to repeat it. It's a common quote, but I think the scope of it is either intentionally misaligned or muddled through years of repetition. For some, the interpretation of this quote is literal. These are the type to say something like, Hitler invaded Russia in the winter even though he knew Napoleon had failed to do that. That's not how I view the quote. For one thing, that common example is just incorrect. But more importantly, I feel the quote has been assigned to these looming historical figures who seem unable to crack open a history book and see what happened to the last guy that tried that shit. That's all well and good, but a vast majority of us aren't going to be leading armies into Russia. History books don't talk about the worker or the layperson. They don't talk about the individual unless the individual is a ruler or just, stupid rich. It's understandable why, but it's still a problem. The best way to solve this problem is to do independent research, and lots of it. That will give you a wide understanding of more relatable history from which to learn. Now, this solution is a best-case scenario, because the reality is that these resources are often difficult to come by, but even more difficult to parse. So, what can we do if looking at the history books doesn't cut it, and independent research is just too unrealistic for the average person? The metaphor I use is that we have to climb 3 mountains. The mountain of our present selves, the mountain of our present reality, and the mountain of our specific past. Climbing these 3 mountains allows us to create a history book of us, and from that we can learn. The reason seeking out personal history is so important is that we are not taught it. Our education system is primarily history, with some math thrown in at relevant times. In calculus, we learn about Newton and Leibniz, L'Hopital and Euler. In science, we learn about Darwin and Einstein. In economics, we learn about Marx and Smith. In English, it's Shakespeare and Shelley. The history we learn ought to be called the history of war. The state has no interest in teaching the people's history because the people's history is how the people learn what the state did to them. History is fundamentally propaganda, in which the state dictates what we learn. I lived my whole life in Wilmington, North Carolina, the site of the only successful armed coup in American history, and I didn't learn about it until I went to the Capitol, and they happened to have a side exhibit about it when I was a sophomore in high school. Rich white men with Gatling guns killed innocent black men and women in the streets. This is an excellent example of the state not wanting history addressed. It makes it easier to scoff at notions like reparations or returning land back to natives when the history we learned is whitewashed and kind. Slavery is a dark past, but it's discussed like America was half good, half evil. The Civil War happened, the slaves were freed, and then everyone was equal. Not even discussing the fact that women still couldn't vote for another 54 years after the end of the Civil War. Equality in America was very, very far from being achieved. It still doesn't exist. Slavery exists in America right now. You may not believe me, or you may think prison labor is not slavery, but the reality is that the 13th Amendment did not end slavery. It changed its name. If your friend John is a piece of shit, he doesn't become a good person by calling himself Chuck. Fuck Chuck. Learning the history they want to keep from you is one of the best ways to stand against the oppressors. The reason I created this podcast is because history happens every day. The first draft of this podcast was 365 episodes, one every day, to discuss exactly what that looks like. Because history happens every day, it's important to pay attention to it. That is how we begin to successfully climb the mountain of our present reality. It's not just paying attention, though. It's paying attention, understanding, and fact-checking. That last one is the tricky one, but it gets easier as you continue to do it. As with history, the news is biased. Finding something you agree with is not suitable. Anything can be spun. Challenging our predisposed beliefs is how we continue to successfully climb that mountain. You will very likely read the same materials as me, do the same fact-checking, and still come to a different conclusion. That's fine. I'm wrong a lot of times about a lot of things. The reason I am able to be confident in what I say, though, is that I know I did the work to reach my opinion. I often change my opinion on issues. When presented with an idea I hadn't considered that challenges my belief, I am able to admit if I think my past held belief was wrong. To me, that is the final tool you need to climb the mountain. An open mind. And with that, I hope you listen to this podcast with an open mind. After all, we are learning together. Now, let's quit the yammering and get to different, more interesting yammering. So, the news. 2020, always coming out with another banger of a news story. What should we talk about? You want to start with the fires on the West Coast? Maybe the hurricanes on the East Coast? Get a little dark, talk about the ice hysterectomies? Maybe just the general COVID situation? We can talk about the presidential election, or we can talk about the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the subsequent inevitable introduction of a very conservative judge into the Supreme Court. We got a lot to talk about. So let's just jump right into it. So let's talk about the fires. To talk about the fires, we have to talk about climate change, which I know is everybody's favorite subject, but it's important. As we continue to ignore the obvious issues that are plaguing the country and the world, we will continue to see more and more and worse fires. As climate change continues, we will see drier summers, we will see more arid land, we'll see larger storms when storms occur. We're seeing it now. Look at these hurricanes. We have 5 hurricanes off the East Coast. A couple of them have already hit, but it's only going to get worse, and it's not going to get better anytime soon. And so a lot of people I see blaming 2020 as the worst year ever, and I think it's misplaced. I don't think it's necessarily fair to the year. I think it's obvious that it's going to get worse every single year. I don't know if it will get better. It's a little bit of a downer. But the reality is, as we continue to ignore climate change, and we obviously have candidates running for office that don't really care about climate change. I mean, I know Biden wants to do the Green New Deal or whatever, but we're at the stage right now where the Green New Deal is too moderate. It's too conservative for what needs to happen. There needs to be huge, overarching change in how we view and talk about climate change. Climate change is the number one issue. College debt, America's fall into fascism, all of that stuff. It won't matter in 20 years if we don't tackle climate change. And we won't, and that's scary. And so I don't know. I don't know how to be positive about this subject. I've tried. My parents tell me that I get too negative with when I talk about climate change, but I'm scared. I really am. Climate change is a very big deal, and we have people like Greta Thunberg who have made very she's brought it to the mainstream in a way that it sort of hasn't been before. But even still, I mean, that's words in a way that are helpful, but they're not doing anything. And I know she notices that, and it just sucks because she's right. We need to do something, and they are killing us, and they don't care, and that's scary, and it's a scary thought. But hopefully going forward, somebody somewhere has a really bold plan. One of the topics that we talk about this week is the Montreal Protocol was signed, I believe on the 17th of 79. No, not that early. 87. And the Montreal Protocol was a very, very effective international treaty that eliminated chlorofluorocarbons. And, that the CFCs were putting a hole in the ozone layer, and eliminating them stopped that. Maybe we will find something equivalent that we can eliminate internationally that will slow and stop climate change, but banking on that is going to lead to our deaths. So we shouldn't do that. We should be active and proactive and demand better. A lot of this podcast will come down to it's our job to demand better. Just sitting back, hoping that people do something that they've never done before is not a strategy for long-term success, and it never will be. So, I don't know. I'm scared of climate change deeply. All right, let's talk about something perhaps a tiny bit more happy. Not any more happy, actually. I lied. Let's talk about these ice hysterectomies. This is a very big, very, very sad story. Very dark. And so let's just get into it. So, if you haven't been paying attention, America has concentration camps on the United States-Mexican border. These camps are brutal. Conditions are awful. ICE as an organization is perhaps one of the worst organizations that I can think of in modern history, at least in modern American history. And so they started rounding people up, and it turns out that they weren't just rounding them up. They were forced sterilizing women by removing their reproductive organs. And it was completely against their will. They did it to I believe thousands, but let me double check that real quick. It's disgusting, and one of my fears with it is that nothing will come of it. Even if Biden does win, unless he very strongly goes after Trump's administration and those involved in everything that's been happening, it won't matter. That was one of the failings of Obama, and it was an intentional failing, not going after Bush's group, because frankly they were war criminals, but Obama was a war criminal too. So, it was intentional. He knew what he was getting into, and going after war criminals sets a precedent, and he would have been gone after in the same regard. I mean, but the U.S. is above war criminal status, which is scary. We don't have war criminals. We have dishonorable discharges, and we have the Patriot Act, but we don't have war criminals. That's for other nations, because for whatever reason, America is above international law, and we always have been. Ever since international law has been created, we have been above it. We follow it sometimes, but we don't need to. If we didn't want to, we could stop, and no one would do anything. And that's scary. And these ICE hysterectomies, they fall in that same category of that's a war crime. That's, forced sterilization, like concentration camps. It's insane. I mean, I hear people like I'm not defending China, but people love to go after China for having Uyghur concentration camps, as if we don't. And it's scary, you know? The notion of a concentration camp should have ended in 1945. The fact that they're not only still in existence, but seemingly more prevalent than ever globally is just horrific. And it's all off the back of American policy. I mean, Hitler developed his concentration camps based on the way Americans treated the Native Americans. I don't think anything will be done about it. Fuck. This news section is so sad because I think I'm a bit of a pessimist here. But I just don't think, like, liberals or conservatives give a shit enough to do anything about clear criminal acts. They'll say they do, but they don't. You know, 200,000 people have died to COVID. And Trump will never, ever face any consequence for that. You know, because he doesn't have to. Because he's rich. And if he does face consequence for it, in some reality in which Biden wins an election and Trump for some god-awful reason stays in America. I suppose god-awful is not the right word. Maybe god-forsaken. Anyway, if he does face justice, he's very old. He's gonna die soon anyway. So, will he face the justice of killing 200,000 people? What is the proper justice for that? You know, in my opinion, justice should come in way of some sort of forgiveness, and that forgiveness should frankly be free healthcare. Because if you're going to kill 200,000 people by taking away their healthcare, and not even taking away their healthcare, but just lying to the general public and taking away their healthcare, the apology to the American people ought to be, hey, you know, we're sorry about that one. Here's free healthcare. But they won't. Biden doesn't want it. So they won't do it. And, you know, we're going to count all these deaths for Trump. Biden, if he wins, he's going to take office. People are going to start dying. And you know, he'll do whatever he does. I mean, hopefully he has a good response to it. Even if he does, people are still going to continue to die from this. Thousands of people are. And he's going to look at that, see it happen, and say the solution is a Medicare for those who want it option, where the entire notion of collective bargaining gets thrown out the window for people who want their current healthcare plan, as if any fucking person wants their current healthcare plan except for Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos and all of Congress. You know, it's absurd. No one likes their healthcare plan. Because healthcare fucking sucks. You have to deal with bastards. You have to deal with people trying to steal your fucking money. And for what? For maybe coverage? For maybe, like, getting healed? You know, there will never be proper apology or reparation or anything for the crimes against humanity that were committed over the past 4 years. And with that, I think I should stop talking about the current events, because not only is it making me sad, but I can't imagine it's making any of you thrilled to listen to the rest of this. So we'll see if this even goes in, and if it does, I'll be surprised a little bit. Alright, so I don't really know what this is going to look like by the end of it, but I think the only way to find out is to get going. So let's start from the very beginning. September 14th, 1901. President William McKinley dies, and Teddy Roosevelt becomes the new United States president. William McKinley was assassinated by an American steel worker and anarchist named Leon Czolgosz. McKinley was a turn-of-the-century Republican and was a marginally progressive individual. He took over the presidency during a time of economic unrest, and through strong action, bold plans, and mobilizing the military-industrial complex, he reinvigorated the economy. His second election focused on his victory in the Spanish-American War, a war in which the United States annexed Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, and Cuba. This imperialist focus was successful, as McKinley, now with running mate Theodore Roosevelt, won in a landslide victory. 6 months into his victory tour, McKinley was killed, making the highly progressive Theodore Roosevelt the new president. Roosevelt was a racist and an imperialist who hated Native Americans. Roosevelt was also a rampant monopoly buster and conservationist. He was the first president to settle a labor dispute, giving coal miners better pay and fewer hours. He failed to give them a union, though, which I'm sure didn't have any negative effects. He also passed the Pure Food and Drugs Act in response to Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, which, while helpful, completely missed the point of the book. But don't worry, Teddy. Everyone was more concerned with the 2 pages about sausage than the 200 about brutal working conditions. Roosevelt's crowning achievement was founding the National Park Service and establishing 121 forest reserves in 31 states, which was approximately 230 million acres. Ultimately, the legacy of Roosevelt was a good one, and his actions furthered the leftist movement by ensuring equality in food and drugs, workers' rights, and conservation's effort. Now, in 1917, the Russian Republic officially replaced the Russian Empire. The Russian Republic was just a short-lived period of control between the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. In 1960, Mobutu Sese Seko seized Congo with the help of the CIA. Mobutu was a totalitarian that played both capitalist Europe and America and communist China. He seized power with the backing of France, Belgium, and the US. These nations saw him as an anti-communist that would stop the spread of communism in Africa. Years later, Mobutu would begin taking money from Mao and the Chinese Communist Party. Mobutu claimed he was not left-wing, nor right-wing, nor center. This is so obviously bullshit based on the fact that he ran a kleptocracy and embezzled billions of dollars from his countrymen. He was a capitalist whether he wanted the title or not. In 1979, Afghan President Nur Muhammad Taraki was assassinated, and his Prime Minister Hafizullah Amin became president. Nur Muhammad Taraki was a communist statesman that made a huge cultural changes as president of Afghanistan. His presidency followed a coup d'etat and was very short-lived after being deposed and later killed by his Prime Minister Hafizullah Amin. Amin succeeded Taraki, but his distrust of the Soviets ultimately led to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December of 1979, which arguably led to the fall of the Soviet Union, or at least contributed to the fall. Alright, so let's move on to September 15th. In 1835, Darwin reached the Galapagos Islands for the first time. Darwin's work on evolution and the core understanding of nature, survival, and adaptation turned the world of biology on its head. His words were revolutionary and, like many scientists before him, were rejected by the religious elite. Eventually, when those same elite figured out how to use his brilliant discovery for racism, his discovery was accepted predominantly as fact. Results still may vary. 100 years later, in 1935, the Nuremberg Laws were passed. This was when the German Nazi Party passed 2 anti-Semitic and racist laws that were designed to exclude Jews from marrying or having sex with Germans, and determined that only those with German or related blood were eligible to be Reich citizens. These laws set the early stage for the horrific events that were to come over the course of the next decade. In 1959, Nikita Khrushchev visited America for the first time. Khrushchev's visit to the United States ultimately didn't do anything to further the Cold War. It didn't cool it, it didn't warm it, it was just a pretty unimportant event. In 1963, 4 Ku Klux Klan members brutally massacred 4 girls in the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing. The 4 girls were named Addie Mae Collins, Carol Denise McNair, Carol Rosalind Robertson, and Cynthia Dion Wesley. 3 of the girls were aged 14 years old, and the youngest was 11. These despicable fucking monsters set up to 15 sticks of dynamite in the church and called the church 1 minute before the explosion, saying nothing more than 3 minutes before hanging up. Martin Luther King Jr. described this attack as one of the most vicious and tragic crimes ever perpetrated against humanity. Alright, now September 16th. 1620! Pilgrims set sail on the Mayflower. This made a lot of people very angry and has been widely regarded as a bad move. In 1955, a coup against Argentine President Juan Perón is launched. Juan Perón was the president of Argentina from 1946 to 1955. He was fascinated with Italian fascism and deeply respected the Greek and German systems of fascism. He admired the way Benito Mussolini, the fascist big-ass head of state in Italy, ruled and brought workers into the government in a way he didn't think was happening otherwise. If you are at all interested in World War II history, you may have heard that many Nazis fled to Argentina to escape persecution in Europe for all the war crimes and stuff. Juan Perón is the reason they had a safe haven in Argentina. He explicitly opened his country as a haven for fleeing war criminals, and him and his wife were very good friends with many of them. In 1979, Rapper's Delight was released. Rapper's Delight, the hip hop, the hippie to the hip hip hop, you don't stop, rock it to the bang bang boogie, say up jump the boogie to the rhythm of the boogie to beat song. Why is that important, you may be asking? Well, we currently live in a world where the idea of genre has become exceptionally muddled. I got into an argument with my friend about a song and whether it was indie. The conclusion was that genre definitions are almost useless because any good artist is noticing what sounds good in another genre and incorporating it into their own music. Lil Nas X shattered the genre definitions with Old Town Road. Rapper's Delight did not create rap music, but it brought it into the mainstream and ultimately created the genre of rap. Rap has served as one of the most influential music genres in modern history and has spurred social awareness in communities around the country. Rappers like Kendrick Lamar and Killer Mike have proven that rap music is incredibly important and a genre for modern poets. Kendrick Lamar won a Pulitzer Prize for Music in 2018 because his words were so important. In 1987, the Montreal Protocol was signed. Chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs, were in whatever they could be in. They were the asbestos of propellants. Serving as refrigerants, propellants, and solvents, CFCs seemed like an amazing solution to solving basic life issues. When we found out the ozone layer was being depleted, we looked for a cause and discovered the overuse of CFCs were actively hurting our planet. The Montreal Protocol is an international treaty to end the use of CFCs globally. This treaty has been highly successful, even being called the most successful international agreement to date. As of 2018, the hole in the ozone layer has stopped growing and has actually begun to heal. September 17, 1778. The Treaty of Fort Pitt was signed. The Treaty of Fort Pitt was the first treaty signed between the United States government and any Native Americans, in this case the Delaware Lenape. As with any American treaty with Native peoples, the treaty was filled with lies and deceit. The Lenape believed the treaty was merely one of free passage to allow the Americans to more easily fight the British. The Lenape also believed they would become a sovereign nation, and the chief, White Eyes, hoped the treaty would allow for the Delaware Lenape to become the 14th U.S. state. In the end, the American government likely killed White Eyes, and the Lenape joined the British against the Americans. Then, 235 years later, the U.S. made a coin depicting the signing of the treaty. Thanks, America. Maybe you should have given some of those coins to the natives you slaughtered mercilessly. Fast forward a couple years, the U.S. Constitution was signed in 1787. The U.S. Constitution fucking sucks because it was written by old white slave-owning racists that thought all men should be equal, but disrupting the status quo of slavery was too radical, and giving natives rights was just off the table entirely. It is a hypocritical document that allowed for the most cruel institution of slavery to exist for hundreds of years while guaranteeing equality. People that love the Constitution never even read the fucking thing and think slavery is bad, but fuck the Constitution. Rewrite it. In 1849, Harriet Tubman escaped from slavery. Harriet Tubman was a slave in Maryland that escaped and became the most prolific Underground Railroad conductor, freeing over 70 people from slavery. She was nicknamed Moses for her daring treks into slaveholding Maryland and leading her people to freedom. Tubman was likely the most important figure in the pre-Civil War period of the Underground Railroad, and she never stopped fighting. She served in the Union Army in the Civil War and, with General David Hunter, freed all of the contraband slaves in the Port Royal district. Lincoln, in the midst of a literal civil war over slavery, didn't want to ruffle any feathers, I guess, and reprimanded Hunter for his actions. Tubman condemned Lincoln's response and served as a nurse in Port Royal. She went on to fight for women's suffrage until she died in 1913. In 1925, Frida Kahlo suffered near-fatal injuries, causing her to take up art. Frida Kahlo was one of the most important artists in Mexican history. In 1927, Kahlo joined the Mexican Communist Party, where she met her fellow artist and future husband, Diego Rivera. They traveled the U.S. and Mexico together, and Kahlo developed her artistic style, combining elements of her pre-Columbian and Catholic beliefs. Her art was featured in Mexico and then in France, where the Louvre purchased one of her paintings, making her the first Mexican artist to be featured in their collection. She died in 1954 at the age of 47. Her work was sort of rediscovered in the 70s, and she became an icon for Chicanos, the feminist movement, and the LGBTQ+ movement. Her work is beloved for its uncompromising depiction of the female experience and form. In 1939, the Soviet invasion of Poland began. The Soviet invasion of Poland marked the Soviet introduction to the Second World War. Germany had begun their invasion 16 days earlier, and the UK and France had declared war on Germany 14 days earlier. In 1978, the Camp David Accords were signed. The Camp David Accords led directly to the Egypt-Israel peace treaty. It also made a lot of people very angry because it made treaties with countries that did not have any representation in the creation of the accords. They basically just said, we're strong enough that we get to decide what happens in the Middle East. And so they did. It fucked a lot of shit up, and that shit is still fucked up. The Palestinian part of the accords were condemned by the UN for not being in accordance with international law. This meant the signers had to go back to the drawing board and rewrite the accords with proper representation and in accordance to UN guidelines. This fixed many of the problems in the Middle East, and that's why it's one of the least conflict-stricken areas of the world. Just kidding. The US signed it, so they give a big middle finger to international law and let Israel do whatever the fuck they wanted, and then funded terrorist groups for decades until the terrorists attacked us, and we had to go in there and show them how to waste trillions of dollars fighting never-ending wars while killing thousands of civilians, and funding more terrorist groups to ensure the military-industrial complex never goes hungry while the costs of the war could have ended world hunger. You know, the American way. In 1980, Poland's first independent trade union, Solidarity, was established. Poland's first union had 10 million members in its first year of existence, after being the first union recognized by a Warsaw Pact state. In 1989, they represented one-third of the country's working-age population. Lech Walesa was given the Nobel Peace Prize for his actions in ending Soviet influence in Poland. By 2010, Solidarity lost 90% of its original membership. In 1991, the first version of Linux was released to the internet. Linux is an open-source software that essentially allows our modern world to operate. Many people are familiar with Linux as a computer software program, but the computer software game is nothing to what Linux is on. Routers, automation controls, smart home technologies, smart TVs, cars, digital video recorders, video game consoles, smartwatches, and even SpaceX rockets use Linux. Linux is open source, which means anyone can view the source code, use it, and modify it under the terms of its respective license. Linux is cool as fuck. September 18th, 1850. The Fugitive Slave Act is passed. The Fugitive Slave Act is one of the most despicable instances of law creation in United States history. The act essentially made it so that Northerns were required to return known escaped slaves to their respective masters. Habeas corpus of escaped and recaptured slaves was suspended. Habeas corpus of escaped and recaptured slaves was suspended, which meant they had no rights in law. No jury was permitted to determine if a free black person was truly free or not, and free black people were not allowed to testify themselves. In 1895, the Atlanta Exposition Speech was delivered. The Atlanta Exposition Speech was an address on the topic of race relations given by Booker T. Washington. It likely led to the Atlanta Compromise, an agreement in which prominent black figures in universities in Atlanta and white politicians agreed that black people would submit to white rule so long as they received equal education and due process of law. This compromise was heavily fought against by prominent black author W.E.B. Du Bois, who believed it was insufficiently committed to the pursuit of social and political equality for black people. Du Bois believed the Atlanta Massacre of 1906, which led to the deaths of more than 25 black people at the hands of whites, was a direct result of the Atlanta Compromise. We'll talk about that in a couple days, though. In 1914, the Irish Home Rule Act became law. So the Irish Home Rule Act was intended to give the Irish the right to self-government within the UK. This would essentially make Ireland no longer a colony, but a kind of equal as Wales and Scotland. It was highly controversial because British people were dicks and hated the Irish just so much. It was put on hold for World War I, and by 1920 it was scrapped in favor for the creation of an independent South Ireland and a loyalist North Ireland. This created no problems that future Irish and British people would have to live with forever. In 1919, the Netherlands gave women the right to vote. In 1948, Margaret Chase Smith became the first woman elected to Senate. Margaret Chase Smith was the first woman to win a seat in the U.S. Senate. Other women had served in the Senate before her, but none were elected by the people. They gained the office after the death of an incumbent. Smith was also involved in the first race, in which two women ran against each other for a seat in the Senate. She was also the first woman to have her name placed in nomination for the presidency at a major political party's convention. She also ardently spoke out against the rise of McCarthyism in America and considered it a major problem in American politics. In 1960, Fidel Castro arrived in New York City as the head of Cuba to the UN. In 2014, Scotland voted against independence from the UK. September 19, 1881, James Garfield dies of injuries after being shot on July 2nd. Garfield was originally a radical Republican that believed Reconstruction should be fast and without compromise. He advocated agricultural technology, an educated electorate, and civil rights for African Americans. He also proposed substantial civil service reforms, which were signed into law by his successor, Chester A. Arthur. Garfield was a progressive leader and disliked Ulysses S. Grant's administration's spoils system. He was a half-breed Republican, but his successor, Arthur, was a stalwart Republican. The stalwarts were more closely aligned with the Grantian Republicans. It's similar to if Joe Biden had announced like Nina Turner or Bernie Sanders to appeal to progressive Democrats. Arthur was a much-beloved president at the end of his term, despite entering with much distrust. Mark Twain wrote of him, "It would be hard indeed to better President Arthur's administration." Arthur's not well known today, despite his relative importance in American history. He was unliked by many of his contemporaries, but as president he was unwaveringly patriotic and avoided many of the downfalls that beset previous administrations. He was not corrupt, and despite making relatively unceremonious decisions as president, they were all very solid decisions. He was not like a stereotypical politician. In 1893, New Zealand became the first country to give women the right to vote. In 1970, Kostas Georgikas set himself ablaze to protest Greek dictator Georgios Papadopoulos. In 1985, Tipper Gore was a Nazi about music because she didn't like bad words and having kids hear bad words. In 1991, the body of Otzi the Iceman was discovered. In 1995, the Unabomber's Manifesto was published. Ted Kaczynski was a childhood progeny that attended Harvard University at the age of 16. Kaczynski was a social and well-liked child, but after being forced to skip grades, he was much younger than his new peers and bullied as a result. His Harvard years were marked with one of the most awful experiments on young minds conducted by the CIA. At the age of 17, Kaczynski began participating in Professor Henry Murray's psychology project that was a part of the CIA's Project MKUltra. Kaczynski spent 200 hours over the course of 3 years being verbally abused and humiliated, whilst hooked up to electrodes monitoring his psychological reactions. This fucked him up for life, and when he got older, he began mailing bombs to universities and airlines, gaining him the nickname Unabomber. Kaczynski sent his manifesto, a 35,000-word essay entitled Industrial Society and Its Future, to various news outlets and demanded it be printed in a major newspaper. If they printed it, he would stop his terrorist acts. His manifesto railed against the existing establishment on both sides. He said leftists were suffering from feelings of inferiority, and conservatives were fools who whine about the decay of traditional values but love advancing technology. Kaczynski believed that technology was leading to the end of the world, and humans needed to revolt against technology to save ourselves. In 2006, the Thai army staged a coup and martial law was declared. The 2006 coup was the first non-constitutional change of government in 15 years for the nation, following a year-long political crisis involving Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra. In 2010, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill was sealed. The Deepwater Horizon oil spill was the largest maritime oil spill in the history of the petroleum industry, therefore the history of the world. 4.9 billion barrels spilled into the Gulf of Mexico. The spill took 5 months to seal and affected millions of wild animals. In 2019, a U.S. drone strike killed 30 Afghan farmers. You know, just firemen. Not terrorists, just farmers. September 20th, 1737. The walking purchase is finished, forcing the secession of 1.2 million acres of Lenape land. September was a rough month for the Delaware Lenape. The Penn family claimed an area of 1.2 million acres along the Delaware River, forcing thousands of Lenape off the land. In a classic case of American hatred of natives, when the Delaware tribe sued Pennsylvania for a mere 314 acres of the original 1.2 million, the U.S. District Court granted Pennsylvania the right to dismiss. It ruled the case non-justiciable, although it acknowledged that the Indian title appeared to have been extinguished by fraud. The U.S. Supreme Court refused to hear this case, upholding the lower court's ruling. Basically, the U.S. government said, yeah, we ripped you off, lied to you, stole from you, and what we did was illegal, but that doesn't mean we have to give it back to you, idiot. In 1870, Italy was unified, which is pretty cool. In 1946, Denmark declined the independence referendum of the Faroe Islands. They are still not independent. In 2001, the War on Terror was started. 9/11 rocked the country. We never forgot, sort of. Bush declared a global war on terror, which really meant he gave himself the ability to declare war on whatever country in the Middle East they so choose. This led to a never-ending war in the Middle East where we funded countless terrorist cells who then started attacking us because, of course they did. There were over 500,000 deaths due to the war on terror, with many likely uncounted due to indirect causes. A vast majority of these deaths were innocent civilians. In 2013, Obama declared the war on terror over, despite not withdrawing troops from the Middle East. Terrorism still exists, surprisingly, and it turns out a war on a concept is an unwinnable war, a la the war on drugs. In 2011, Don't Ask, Don't Tell was ended. Don't Ask, Don't Tell was enacted by President Clinton in 1993. It prohibited military personnel from discriminating against or harassing closeted homosexual or bisexual service members or applicants. It also barred openly gay, lesbian, and bisexual persons from military service. It took Obama 3 years in office to repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell because the Supreme Court hadn't decided if gays were people yet. It turns out they are. The repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell was a very important moment for the American LGBTQ+ movement, as it almost perfectly coincided with the legalization of gay marriage. And with that, we reach the end. I've never been very good at endings, but yeah, I really hope you enjoyed listening. I really enjoyed making that, and it was a lot of work. Between the two documents I have over 6,000 words written, and that was pretty sparse of what I actually wanted. This episode came out a little later than I intended. My cat got an upper respiratory infection, and so I spent 2 days stressing about that because I didn't know what the problem was. But my plan is to have these out Friday, Saturday, or Sunday of the week. I will be making the episode every week, so even if I get pushed back to the extent of having, a couple days of buffer, I will make 52 of these. So even if I have to go a little back in time, even if it's not directly relevant to what is happening like that week, that's fine for me. Ideally, that shouldn't happen. I should be able to produce this podcast well enough. A big thing is that school gets in the way. And so I lost 2 days of productivity, not just for this podcast, but for school as well. And for me, this podcast is a side project. It is not my primary goal. Passing college is my primary goal right now. And so I had papers to write, and it just had to be put on the back burner for a second. And so this came out a day later than I wanted. It really came out 3 days later than I wanted, but, that's fine. The next episode should come out Friday, Saturday, or Sunday of next week. Ideally. We'll see. I think I should be able to make that work. But, again, thank you so much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed. I really do enjoy making this. It's a lot of fun, and I'm learning a lot. I mean, this is, so many of these things I had either not ever heard about, or if I had heard about it, I'd never heard in detail that I'm going into. And so it's very fun. It's a very cool, creative endeavor for me. So I hope you enjoy. I ramble a bit, so hopefully it didn't sound too rambly, but yeah, I think I should just end it there before I continue to ramble. Thank you so much for listening.